to order committee of the whole. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Kelly,
Here.
Bishop, Brancatelli,
Here.
Cleveland, Conwell, Griffin, Hairston,
Here.
Johnson,
Here.
Usher Jones,
Here.
Joe Jones, Casey,
Present.
McCormick,
Present.
Mooney, Polinsik, Santana, Slife,
Present.
Zone.
Present.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Let me read my housekeeping stuff. This committee of the whole is being held during the COVID-19 emergency declaration and is being conducted as a virtual meeting in accordance with Ohio's open meeting laws as amended by Sub-House Bill 197. Council, in compliance with the charter and rules of council, a copy of all legislation to be heard during this committee of the whole was furnished previous to the meeting to every council member through a council email. It is hereby acknowledged without objection that all members of this council have received this legislation. Further, council members must be visibly present for all votes. If you're not visibly present, your vote will not be counted. So we are calling to order committee of the whole. We have the agenda is not heavy, but it's all important stuff. This is the order we're going to go in for planning purposes. We're going to do public health, planning, and then there's 2 council resolutions, and then we're going to go to the presentation by community development regarding the tax abatement. From there, we will take a short break, and I would ask people not to sign off, and we will roll right into the council meeting. So that is the agenda we are following. At the request of Councilman Johnson, we are holding ordinance 534-2020. So with that, I'm going to begin. Is everybody that needs to be from public health here? Okay, I'm not seeing people, but okay. Is there anybody from public health? Let me start there. I'm trying to look at the screen here. Okay,
I don't see anybody from public health.
All right, let's go to planning. Let me find that now. So let's go to ordinance number 506-2020. By Councilmembers Brancatelli and Kelly by departmental request, an emergency ordinance authorizing Director of City Planning to enter into an amendment to contract number PS 2019-138 with Code Studio Inc. to extend the term of the contract up to 1 year and to add additional services for form-based zoning for the form-based zoning pilot initiative. Is Director Collier with us?
I don't see him either.
Okay, so we do have this council meeting was on the calendar, right? I'm not missing something? Okay. At 10:08, we have nobody for our first 2 pieces. I will now move to the council pieces, which are fairly
Mr. President, point of order. The health department claims that they did not get a notice, but I thought that they did have a notification. So just point
it's
of reference.
unusual. It's not a small matter that we're dealing with in health, but that being said, we have resolution. This is an easy one. I was thinking of another one. We have resolution, please forget that I just said it. Resolution 554-2020, Councilmember Conwell, an emergency resolution urging the Cleveland Metropolitan School District to change the name of Patrick Henry Middle School to Stephanie Tubbs Jones Middle School. Councilman Kevin Conwell, are you with us? We're having a tough day here. Without objection, resolution 554, are there any questions, comments on resolution 554-2020? Okay, or resolution 554-2020 stands approved. At this point, we're going to move to the presentation from community development regarding the tax abatement, or otherwise known as the equitable, what'd you say, Councilman Zahn?
Equitable Development Task Force.
That one, yeah.
Yes.
Because this has been the result of a tremendous amount of work, and I want to thank everybody for the time that was put into this. This is a very important, initiative for the city. And today is just a report. We're not voting on anything, but I think it's important that we do receive these frequent updates on something of this significance. So with that, before I begin, Councilman Brancatelli, before I turn the floor to Director Maness, do you have anything to add, or Councilman Zone, or Councilman Cleveland, or Councilman McCormick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly, as you stated, there's been a lot of great work going on this, and appreciate all the stakeholders who've been really taking the deep dive on what this means for our city, and I want to thank all their efforts for it. And also, as you stated, this is not a vote today, and it's not the end. This is the beginning of a process that we're looking at a 10-year plan. So we had sent this study out to all our colleagues and stakeholders, so it's been out there publicly for folks to view and weigh in on. And the director will talk about the upcoming meetings and what that means for us and our next steps. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councilman Zone?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just would add, for context, for those who aren't familiar with this initiative, a group of council members started meeting in the fall of 2017. In 2018, we kind of memorialized and formalized our working group and partnered with another working group that was operating out of Cleveland Neighborhood Progress and joined our alliances. We had a working group that has met for over 2 years now, totaling over 40 members actively participating every 6 weeks, meeting, debating, discussing, and engaging. And what you're going to hear today is the culmination of findings that, and I'll let Director Maness kind of set it up, but work that we did when we engaged consultants to go into a deeper dive around the analysis of this work. In some neighborhoods, there are real pressure points around development, and this was a reaction to try to make sure that we work towards and strive towards building strong mixed income communities throughout our city. And so this is serious work, and I have much appreciation for all of those who participated in this process. And I'm thankful to our consultants for the work they did and the findings that you're going to hear about later today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilman Zone. Councilman Kerry McCormick?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, I'll echo the comments of thanking everyone that's been involved in the process so far. And also just to say that, this is a piece of a much larger conversation around housing options and equitable housing in the city of Cleveland. I'm sure the director will mention their efforts around a 10-year housing plan. But this is a piece of a larger conversation that, about how do we have a robust housing plan for the city of Cleveland, including affordable housing options. The only other thing I'll mention, Mr. Chairman, too, is that from the beginning, one of the things that we all agreed upon was that we wanted to work from data and facts and research, not just kind of our feelings on this issue. So really want to highlight the fact that this deep dive of information was done to inform the work that you'll hear about today, but also the work moving forward. Again, we wanted to be working from real data and information. There's a lot of passion around this issue, and that's important. Perspective is important. Real life examples and anecdotes are important as well, and they've influenced this process. In addition to that, though, the data has really been a major component of it. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the presentation.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Cleveland, any opening remarks before we begin the presentation on tax abatement?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning, all. And I share and firmly believe in the comments spoken by my colleagues, Councilman Zone and Councilman McCormick. And I would just add that, again, this is a piece of a much larger puzzle that we're all beginning to know, and some of us have already known, are part of a larger puzzle related to equity, economic mobility, social justice in this country. And I think that if we can, working on this piece, dealing with the creation and the preservation of affordable housing in our community, and find ways. This is one way to stabilize our neighborhoods by stabilizing our families in the neighborhood. So I look forward to the presentation of the report, but more importantly, our work going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. With that, I will turn the floor over to Director Maness for the presentation, and we will then take questions. And if you'll please introduce any guests that that have helped you on this.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Council President Kelly. And yes, I was going to mention that as Councilman Zone said, as we started this conversation, it was really led by Enterprise Community Partners, and Emily Longard is here with us from that organization, and Linda Warren from CNP. They were convening groups with council, many of our CDC partners, and the view was that if we brought this into the administration, it would really be a great way to have this be a collaborative process, that the community was engaged in, City Council and the administration moving it forward. And it does seem crazy to think that we started that in October 2018. And as Councilman Carey said, sorry, McCormick, he says Carey and McCormick in the wrong order there for me. And that, sorry, I don't think I've ever done that before. As Councilman McCormick stated, we very quickly understood that if we were going to be effective here, we needed to ground the work that we were doing in data, in research. We needed to ensure that while this is a really emotional topic, that we could, it's not that we would leave the emotion out of it. We needed the neighborhood, the resident, the stakeholder feedback, but we needed to counter and ensure that that was informed by good data and research. But we did start with two main ideas, main things that we wanted to focus on that will carry us through, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves of, that we're looking for tax policy that promotes development across the city at multiple price points and products so that we can promote mixed income communities. And that's, a guiding principle for us, and tax policy that protects our current residents from displacement. And those two things I think you'll hear throughout the study. And again, realizing some of the limitations of our team, and I did also want to mention that Commissioner Green, who runs the tax abatement program out of our department, and Assistant Director Wackers, who has supported this study, are on the call as well. But we knew that we were going to need a research team to help us bring the data to the table, and then a strong stakeholder engagement team to ensure that so many of the partners that invest in our city, whether they're as residents or as developers, had a good voice in this study. And as we get started, I'll let Mike introduce the team. But just from a process perspective, we put out an RFP from the development cluster in spring of 2020, which again is still this year, so that doesn't feel quite so bad. And oh no, that's why it's wrong. In spring of 2019, yeah, it's like, that sounds way too good. In spring of 2019, and started this work in August of 2019. And we're wrapping this study up in January with the idea that we do presentations through February and March. We chose the team of the Reinvestment Fund, Public Finance Management, Greater Ohio Policy Center, and then added Neighborhood Connections in to really augment our neighborhood work. And I think, two of you mentioned, and we'll talk about this more, but as we dug into this work, what we found is something that Director Ebersol has said a few times, that if we ever question the need of the city to have a 10-year housing and investment plan, this tax abatement study, the research here showed us that our hope that we could use tax abatement to encourage equitable development still stands. It's absolutely still how we want to move forward. But the data really showed us that we're going to need to bring other tools to bear. And so as I turn it over to Mike to start talking about the work that was done, I just want all of you to keep in mind that this data, some of what you all heard last week about the middle neighborhoods work that we're doing, all of these things layer on top of each other and will contribute to a 10-year housing and investment strategy for the city. This was a critical first step, but it is really just the beginning, and operationalizing all of this is all of our charge. And so again, just the first step here, but with that, I'll turn it over to Mike Norton from Reinvestment Fund to introduce the team and explain how we move forward with the study. The last thing I want to mention is that we did brief council on the data in October of 2019, and then again in February of 2020. So we're not going to be rehashing a lot of the data collection piece so that we can focus on the recommendations and keep the council meeting moving as well. So
Thank
go
you.
ahead, Mike.
Hello, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for having us today. It's really a nice opportunity for us to share some of the results of this work and our thinking around the recommendations that were presented in the report. Before we jump into the presentation and I sort of share the slides, and quickly just do introductions of the rest of the study team, and I'll just call everyone out as I see you. So I'm Mike Norton, I'm Chief Policy Analyst at Reinvestment Fund, and we have Randy, you want to say hello? Randy, you want to, can you unmute? I have to ask to unmute you. No, never
Yes,
mind.
hi, I'm Randy Bauer. I'm a director with Public Financial Management and lead our tax policy practice.
And Allison Goebel.
Hi, good morning. I'm Allison Goebel. I'm the Executive Director of the Greater Ohio Policy Center. We're based in Columbus and work statewide.
And Kayla Gesich.
Kayla Geschke. Good try.
Always.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. And Neighborhood Connections did the resident engagement portion of the study.
Great. And so I'm going to quickly share my screen with you guys. And you have all seen most of this work and in one form or another, and these slides have been shared previously in advance of the meeting. So I'm going to go through them somewhat expeditiously and then provide as much opportunity for time as we have for discussion and questions for the group, because I know that's sort of oftentimes one of the most important parts of this. So when we think back to the start of the tax abatement study that Director Maness had mentioned, it was last summer. There are a couple of main objectives that we set out to achieve, is both to just understand the impact of the abatement program on the community, on residents, just really understand how the abatement's been used over time. Really wanted there to be a concerted engagement process throughout the study period that engaged both folks in the housing industry and developers and people that are creating new housing, but particularly for the residents and people that are living in neighborhoods that are experiencing a variety of different conditions on the ground where they live. And we wanted to use both our analysis and the engagement process as a way to identify potential programmatic adjustments that could inform this program going forward. We saw the study team here, everybody just did their introductions. So the main things that we did over the course of roughly August 2019 to about January 2020 is we analyzed every sort of residential abatement that was issued between 2004 and 2018. We estimated the economic impact these abatements have had, both from a tax revenue standpoint and sort of a forecast revenue standpoint, and sort of the derivative economic activity associated with the abatements. We sort of did a peer review of similar cities and how they use their abatements to look at similar features or other opportunities for programmatic adjustments. And then we conducted a bunch of interviews and public hearings with folks that are connected to the abatement, both from a business standpoint, but then also from in the neighborhoods. And so when we think about the abatement program, everybody here is probably familiar with what a tax abatement is, right? They're designed to encourage housing development by waiving a portion of a residential property tax for a set period of time. In Cleveland, it's been fairly standard for the past 15 years or so. You have 15-year abatement, 100% of the value of the property is abated. And the only main requirement is that you meet minimum green building standards for new construction or for renovation to obtain the abatement from the city. So when we look historically, at sort of the utilization of the abatement, since probably since the housing collapse, right, of 2008, 2009, the abatement usage has steadily declined from a peak of about 2007 we had about almost 7,400 abatements issued. To 2018, it was about 4,200 abatements issued. And then we're seeing most of our abatements are still for single family development. So over this study period, about almost 80% of the abatements have been for single families. But as renovation is sort of increasingly becoming more common. So when you look at this table down here, the renovation making up an increasingly large share of the abatement activity since 2010. When we wanted to really understand sort of the geographic distribution of abatements, and we also wanted to understand them within the context of the different types of neighborhoods that are in Cleveland. And so we had estimated this displacement risk ratio for all of the city of Cleveland to identify places where home values are increasing at a rate that is much greater than the increase in people's median incomes. And when the ratio between household prices and median incomes gets to be to a certain point, people that are living there or people that are trying to move in who look similar to historic residents start feeling some pressure in terms of their ability to pay for their housing. You see these, and if you look at the overall city of Cleveland, most of the city are in these sort of lower prices and sort of low pressure. So 54% of the city itself have declining home prices, and there's just not residential pressure. But when you look at sort of places, there are about 6% of block groups that you see in these blue hued areas where you have median household incomes that are not keeping pace with the increasing home values. Right? So you have highest prices or median prices are over about $75,000 in these sort of Detroit Shoreway, Tremont, Ohio City areas where you're getting some residential pressure and people will be feeling some displacement risk associated with increasing housing values. Right? But the vast majority of the city is really characterized by sort of declining prices and need for stabilization. Right? And so one of the things that we observed too in the most recent years is that you're starting to see the abatements themselves become increasingly concentrated, particularly in some of these higher priced and higher pressure places, right? So these really only make up a very small share of the city. But in 2004, from 2004 to 2008, these high pressure, high price markets only accounted for about 7% of the abatement activity, which is roughly consistent with their share of the city overall. But between 2014 and 2018, they're accounting for about 22% of the abatements, right? So there's only about 6% of the block groups are getting about almost a quarter of the abatements in the most recent period. And so we've been seeing that is sort of a trend, and people, when we talk to people in these neighborhoods, they observe that and they sort of feel like the abatements are sort of becoming more concentrated in these high pressure areas. And on the other hand, right, so even though these abatements are not being used as much, and they are becoming increasingly concentrated in certain areas of the city, they do generate a tremendous amount of economic activity within the city of Cleveland, even when the number of them is going down, right? So when you look at the peak of sort of foregone abated revenue in 2007 is roughly the same as it is in 2018, around $5.5 million of foregone revenue. So even though the number of abatements is going down, the value of those abatements in 2018 is roughly consistent to where it was at the peak of usage, right? And when you think about how the economic benefits of abatements sort of ripple through the local economy, we're thinking about spending by homeowners to build and to renovate homes. We're talking about builder and developer spending on the materials that they're using to actually do the building, the wages that they're paying to their folks, and then derivative spending that is induced by all those people that are getting paid to produce housing, right? Is all derivative economic benefits. And we don't necessarily know that all of those dollars are being circulated within the city of Cleveland. But, you know, generally we're thinking if you have about $170 million in outputs, you have about 56 million in wages. Total economic impact in 2018 is about $226 million for about $5.5 million of foregone revenue. Right? So that $5.5 million of foregone revenue from property tax by not sort of collecting property tax on newly abated properties is sort of driving a lot of economic activity associated with actually building the properties, renovating the properties, and then the continual circulation of those dollars through the local economy. And so when we think about where this foregone revenue comes back into the city, because when we started the study in 2004, or where the study period started in 2004, a lot of those initial abatements are starting to burn off and are going to start coming back onto the rolls in 2020, 2021, going forward. So we look here about 2021, this is 2020, the biggest beneficiary of tax dollars coming back onto the rolls is clearly the school district of Cleveland Metropolitan School District. They're standing to have an increased revenue of about $10 million in 2020, and that's going to steadily increase over the next 20 to 30 years, particularly as abatements continue to roll off and come back into the city. But again, the school district is a primary beneficiary here. The city is collecting some revenue back and the county a little bit, but really Cleveland Metropolitan School District stands to gain the most. And so we did these initial analyses as a way to try and sort of understand the lay of the land. And then we used a lot of these results to go out and talk to folks in the community, both on the real estate development side, mortgage finance side, housing finance side, and also to folks in the community to understand their experience with abatements and understand how they see the value of the program and how it could be adjusted going forward. You can see on the slide here all of the different folks that we talked to, over 250 residents and about 75 folks attached to the real estate industry here in Cleveland. And one of the things that we wanted to understand in the course of doing the analysis and things that came up both in terms of the conversations that we had with folks in the community and with some of the developers is to really try and understand some of these concerns that folks raised, right? So we tried to look at the relationship between abatements and foreclosure activity. And there's pretty strong evidence against the relationship between foreclosures and abatements, and that properties with abatements that expired had lower foreclosure rates than unabated homes. There was moderate evidence against the idea that owners of abated homes move when their abatements are up, right? So they didn't seem to move at higher rates than typical people living in their homes, that they didn't have sort of move in, move out rates that would suggest that people were moving once their abatements burned off. There was some evidence to suggest that abatements do have an influence on surrounding home prices. So the rate of price increase was similar across the city, right? So over the course of the study period, the rate of increase for all properties in the city was roughly the same, but in higher value markets, the dollar value returns are greater when you have even though the rate of increase is the same. Does that make sense? So when the rate of increase is the same, when you go from a $20,000 house to a $30,000 house, you still get a lot more bang for your buck when you go from a $100,000 house to a $150,000 house, even though the rate is the same. Right? And whether or not our abatements are leading to greater sales volume. So there was some evidence to suggest that the areas where the most abatements are taking place, so you have more sales volume, similar to prices, the rates are roughly comparable across the city, even if the volumes are increasing at a higher rate. The overall volume is higher within the stronger markets. So I'm going to go through the recommendations now and quickly review them here on one review slide, and then there'll be some evidence or some of the findings associated with these different recommendations. First recommendation is to simply the city should continue to offer the abatement. That it's a really important tool, but one among many that the city is going to need to drive its equitable development goals. That they should be considering an abatement cap of $300,000 for new single-family developments. And so it doesn't say on the slide, but new construction is the idea here for the $300,000 cap. To implement a but-for requirement for market rate multifamily developments where the abated values are greater, where the abated value is above $5 million. To create a community benefits agreement for developers of market rate multifamily developments in the specific areas that are experiencing high prices and high pressure. To develop a specific market-based differentiation of the amount of abatement and the duration of abatement that's tied to displacement pressure and other market triggers. And then to implement improvements in transparency to the overall application process and enhance communication within city departments that are affected by the abatements themselves. And all of these recommendations, in the current climate that we're living in, we really think it's important that they are taken in consideration and tied to the work that's going to be done for the 10-year housing plan going forward, and seeing that the tax abatement is sort of one tool within a broader 10-year housing strategy to incentivize and encourage equitable development goals. So when you think about let's go through a couple of the recommendations, and just to provide some of the evidence that we saw for why this recommendation is still important. So the overall housing market in Cleveland is still pretty fragile generally, right? So prices are still very low and haven't quite rebounded. So if you look at median sales price in 2005 was almost $80,000. And here in 2018, still about just over, $40,000 or around $40,000. So creeping back up from 2011, but still way off of the peak. Volumes are coming back more strongly, and there has been activity, but the abatement is still really important for ensuring that keeps happening. Beyond the abatement, we think it's really important that there are additional tools that are implemented and used for protecting housing affordability. But one of the things that was very clear in our analysis is that income rather than increasing prices was a primary driver for affordability challenges for people in the city of Cleveland. And so about a quarter of homeowners and about almost half of renters are paying at least 30% of their income on housing. And when you look at the affordability of housing in the city of Cleveland, at virtually every income threshold, 80% of city median income, this is a median income of this is an income of about $20,000 a year. 75% of the homes are still affordable to people making that salary, right? 82% of homes in Cleveland are still affordable to people making about $30,000 a year. And 86% of the homes in Cleveland are still affordable for people making about $35,000 a year. So it's not that the housing is too expensive, but the affordability challenges that you see over here around half of renters and a quarter of homeowners who are cost burdened is more from income as opposed to housing values. There are other kinds of tools that people have used that other cities are using to directly deal with housing affordability challenges. Long-time owner occupancy programs, circuit breaker programs that sort of cap property tax increases, actual caps on property tax, inclusionary zoning, housing trust funds. All of these tools are things that can be under consideration as you sort of move forward. And it's worth noting that there is ongoing discussions at the State House around property tax relief, and the Ohio General Assembly has the authority to provide these exemptions for cities to implement these different tools. GOPC is sort of part of the coalition that is advancing this work in the State House, and Allison is here on the call, and if there are folks who have more questions about how this process is playing out in Columbus, we can talk about that when we get to the Q&A. The second recommendation of establishing a cap on the maximum value for new construction of single-family homes at $300,000 was really designed to sort of target places where people are buying homes where their property taxes aren't really driving the decisions that they're making. And it's also sort of targeting a very small share of the overall market, right? So when you look at all of the homes sold between 2017 and 2018, only about 2% of them were over $300,000. But when you look at all the abated homes sold between 2017 and 2018, almost a quarter of them were over $300,000. And so that gives you a sense too that some of the abatements are disproportionately sort of concentrated at the higher end, but people that are buying houses for $300,000 aren't buying their houses based on their property tax burden. Probably it's not going to sort of tip them one way or another, and so it's less important for these borrowers, and it's a way to sort of provide a bit of a cap on how much abatement people can get for building high-end luxury condos and houses, right? And targeting for folks who really need it. When we think about recommendation 3 of the but-for test for high-cost multifamily developments, the idea here is that actually this is a way to add a higher bar for establishing the importance of the abatement to make the development actually feasible for the developer. And so they would have to demonstrate that they could not profitably build the project itself without the abatement. And again, similar to the single family cap at $300,000, a multifamily cap at abated value of $5 million really only sort of affects about 11% of multifamily parcels, right, between 2015 and 2019. But again, these really relatively few number of parcels accounted for over half of the abated value of multifamily abatements between the same time period. So again, very small number of projects with very high values are sort of eating up a bigger share of the overall outstanding abated value. Right? And so having this additional step in there is a way for the department to look a little bit more closely and just ensure that it's really critical and important for moving forward. The next recommendation 4 of creating a framework for community benefits agreements in high pressure areas. Community benefits agreements are signed contracts between the city and real estate developers that require the developers to provide specific kinds of amenities or mitigations to local community and neighborhoods where they're doing their development. Right? And so the idea here is that these would only be required in high pressure areas. And so they would need to be tied to ongoing monitoring of the real estate market by the city to ensure that they are being implemented in the right places. But there are, and this is really at this point only is about 3% of Cleveland's block groups, so these blue areas that you would see here on the map would be subject to community benefits agreements for new market rate multifamily developments. And the idea here is that some of the benefits get sort of pulled back into the neighborhood or retained in the neighborhood. And there are a number of different considerations for developing the community benefits agreements. And this is, again, the sort of thing that'll be important over the course of the 10-year housing study to be thinking through collectively, both amongst yourselves and also with people in the communities where you, that you represent. And fifth recommendation is, did I miss one? 4, no, 5, okay. Fifth recommendation is to develop to adjust the abatement and how it operates as a function of the strength of the local market, right? And so the example that you see here on the left is the city of St. Louis, where they have a market-based components that inform how the abatement applies in different places. So it could be as a function of the value of homes, the amount of vacancy in the place, the amount of investment activity, the condition of the buildings, the tenure status of people living there, how much market pressure there is in the place. All of these things are sort of indicators that would provide a way for differentiating how the abatement is offered for how long and for what percentage of the abated value could be adjusted depending on how much it's needed in those places. And finally, the sixth recommendation was really around improving the transparency of the process, particularly on one hand, making the application process more transparent and streamlined for people that are doing development work. But then on an internal communication side, making sure that there folks in other city departments, say the school district, Parks and Rec, that are impacted by the abatement are getting notices of properties that are being submitted for abatement so that they can find ways to be part of conversations, particularly if you end up having community benefits agreements attached to them, that they could end up being informed those conversations and just know what's going on in the neighborhoods where they have responsibilities. So those are the high level sort of takeaways from the report that we did and the recommendations that we generated. When we open it up now for questions, and I'm going to come back so we can all see each other. I don't think everybody probably has the same view that I have.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to MC questions, Q&A? We do that.
Thank you. Director Menace, do you have any further speakers, or are we ready to go to question and answer?
No, I think let's go to question and answer, and then I'll just wrap up with next steps of the study as we close.
Okay, very good. If people could use the hand raise function if you have questions on this topic, and we will again be very well informed as this process moves forward. Councilman Mike Polenzek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, my honorable colleagues, and to all who participate. I want to commend my colleagues who've been involved in this process, and there's been a great deal of data and information provided, which I think is very helpful. And I would make a request that if we can receive that PowerPoint, that information would be very helpful. You know, one of the things that has troubled me, I came into the body years ago when tax abatement was just getting started in the city. There was a great deal of controversy and issues pertaining to it. And I think over the years, the council, working with the administration, has tried to tailor different packages and have tried to work collectively together. But what really concerns me is that when you look at the data that's been provided to us, that 54% of the block groups are declining in the city with low prices or depressed prices. That should alarm, and that should send off rockets around all of us as it pertains to what's happening in our city. When you look at, again, the amount of block rent that's come into the city over the years, the other type of funds that have come in, you have to step back a moment and wonder if in fact those dollars have been targeted adequately and properly. The other factor that I think is very important when we look at where properties are increasing in value and where they're diminishing, I think there's a direct correlation as well with the level of city services, quality of life, crime, and public safety. I just had a good friend of mine, empty nesters who live in the city in another, they don't live in my ward, but they live in quote unquote one of the trendy neighborhoods, who just put their house up for sale and left and moved to Copley. I don't even know where Copley's at. But when I found out, I asked him why. He said, because of the increase in crime in the neighborhood. And he said, I don't care what programs the city floats to me or my family. If I don't feel safe or I don't feel I'm getting the services, tax abatement or whatever doesn't mean anything to me. So as we look at these programs and we look at initiatives, we've got all of us in council and with the administration, we understand quality of life has become a paramount concern today in the city of Cleveland, in our neighborhoods. And I think with people staying home as a result of COVID-19 and all of us dealing, we look at the increase in homicides in the city, felonious assaults, all those things, those have a direct bearing upon our neighborhood stability. So when I look at the recommendations and some of the things that have been put forward, and I obviously support that initiative, but we've got to really, there's a linkage here. It's just not about tax abatement anymore or trying to encourage people to move into our city. We've got to give them something. It's that old saying again, what realtors say, location, location, location. And if we can't give them that quality of life, if we can't give them the amenities they want, you can give them all the tax abatement they want, they're not going to stay or they're not going to invest in our city. So I really appreciate the information that's been put forward because I think it's very helpful. It gives us a blueprint as to what has happened in our city, what neighborhoods have stabilized. And as we see, very few neighborhoods, unfortunately, are quote unquote stabilized or trendy, where the majority of neighborhoods in our city have declined. We got to figure out how to address that decline. So with a new policy being put forth with tax abatement, can that help us? Of course it can. But we've got to get to the bigger issue here, and that is directing our attention to quality of life with the administration and making them aware that these are paramount concerns and importance to our citizens. I hear it every day. I mean, I'm on that phone and getting those emails every day about quality of life issues. So do I want to see the tax abatement policy continue? Yes, I do, because I think it's helped us. But we've got to look at how we link it to other things that are transpiring in our city. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope to get the PowerPoint that's been presented today, and it should make us all sit back a moment and realize we've got some big challenges in front of us, some very big challenges. So I don't know if I would like to hear back from many of the folks involved in the study as it pertains to your connection, your correlation with stability and quality of life issues.
A lot of what you mentioned falls outside of community development, but if anybody wants to take a shot, Director Maness, do you have any response to Councilman Plenzik?
I don't, beyond just the point that you made that I think was really important, that the tax abatement tool, that a lot of the data here provides a blueprint for what we will need to do more broadly with the housing study. And that ultimately, right, people are coming into neighborhoods, which was really covered in the middle neighborhoods presentation last week, for a suite of amenities that make them want to stay in the community. And I do think that's community development's broader purview, and what we want to take a broader look, not just at the affordable housing tools, but tools that will incentivize private development and private investment in our community. So we're more able to meet the needs of people all along that continuum, not just the high-end trendy markets and then affordable housing, but those who are more our middle-class families that have been the bread and butter of this community.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, my last comment is from the standpoint, we hear so often in those quote unquote trendy neighborhoods, as people are buying those $400,000 houses and the family next door has been there for 30 years, but now they're retired on a fixed income. And we saw that with the last county reevaluation, where those property values substantially increased and put a great burden on those families. I've noticed, and I think you somewhat touched upon it in the presentation, some counties across the country have actually put a limitation on how much you can increase someone's property tax through a revaluation. And I've heard some areas it's 3%, some areas that it's 6%, the maximum. Would someone care to comment on that? Because that would be a county issue that we'd have to address with the Cuyahoga County Council members.
Director or Ms. Norton? Who would?
I did want to give Allison Goebel from GOPC and Emily an opportunity to speak to this, because they're really working on the statewide coalition and could provide the best information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So again, I'm Allison Goebel with the Greater Ohio Policy Center. We do a range of things at our nonprofit, including state policy work. So you're right, Councilman, there are communities around the country that provide caps and other tools to really support those families. As you mentioned, legacy homeowners who have been in neighborhoods for a long time and are experiencing increased property taxes. We are seeing that in select neighborhoods across the state, and Emily Lungard, who's here, Linda Warren, who's here, is they are part of a working group that we staff and steward at Greater Ohio that includes members from the other major metros around the state. We are working on this right now. The issue is that property taxes are determined by the state General Assembly, and so any changes to it, even if they're administered at a local level, have to be approved and authorized by the state legislature. So there are two pieces of legislation currently that have been introduced, one from Senator Williams, who represents parts of Cleveland, another piece of legislation that's been introduced by a senator based here in Columbus. Both are looking at some sort of caps, and our working group that is comprised of affordable housing advocates and practitioners and experts are also investigating a potential cap structure. So this is in the process, it's early on. When you get the slides provided to you, there is a slide there that includes a link to a sign-on sheet that you can add your name to be updated as things move forward, and then also demonstrate your support of some sort of reform in the future. Emily, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I did just briefly want to add something. Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Director. And truly thanks to this entire body for having this conversation today. It's pretty incredible to be having this rigorous discussion into really important policies about equity. So yeah, as Allison mentioned, we are sort of working on a two-prong approach here, just as we're having this conversation about how we can make our tax abatement policy more equitable or taking that step towards more equity here in Cleveland. We're making sure to have the conversation about property tax relief on the state level, because that is really where those tools for property tax relief can happen. We heard over and over again during the course of this study, just as I'm sure you all hear from your constituents, about this sort of increasing pressure, particularly on longtime residents, longtime homeowners in our communities. So we heard that, and we want to make sure we're being responsive to it. So what I'll highlight in the slide that Allison mentioned and that Mike presented is this sign-on. So if you have constituents and residents expressing this pressure they're feeling, this property tax burden, we want to hear from them. We want to capture their stories and make sure we amplify them on the state level. So as we push forward on this more equitable tax abatement policy here locally, we need to push forward on the state level on some property tax relief. And we need to make sure that Cleveland stands with Columbus and Cincinnati and all the other residents, while maybe a small group now, to make it clear that this pressure is taking place, and we should be putting the tools and the frameworks out there now, so we can address these issues before, hopefully before they become any greater. So yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this, because I think it is it's really important that we keep this two-prong approach front and center, local solutions, but then of course state solutions as well.
And Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, and to the presenters again, I thank you very much for that response, because there's no doubt there's tremendous pressure on families that are on fixed income, Social Security, again, have done the right thing, that have stayed in the city and have done their best, and have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly at times. And now they're being forced, and I've heard from people say, I might have to leave my home. I might be forced out of my home because I can't afford the property taxes. So that should never happen. That should never happen in a city where someone who stayed, who invested, who believes in our city, now, because that quote unquote neighborhood has become trendy, now are forced out. We can't have that type of gentrification taking place in the city. So again, thank you to all. I look forward to the information. I want to commend my colleagues, all who've been involved in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Blaine Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask the presenters if they can just give me brief answers. If I need to follow up, I will with any of the presenters, because I have about 5 questions and I want to be respectful of times. But just to follow up on the line of question of my colleague, Mike Polensik, I love new development. I love new developers coming into the neighborhood. But I also believe that we have to do a better job of the city of fighting for people who have invested and weathered the storm in the city of Cleveland for a long time. And I'm very, very interested in what tool in this, because I'm trying to make sure I understand that, is to help those longtime homeowners with their properties. I know that the theory is the more that we build some of these other homes, we create wealth, which means that they have more equity in their property. However, I'm really interested in what tools we need to try to develop for doing that. So I'm going to ask about, number one, the inclusionary zoning. Does that also mean creating historic neighborhood overlays and geographic targeting. I look at areas like Larchmere and Little Italy, which you mentioned as high pressure areas. How are we looking at those kind of historic designations? Is that what you're talking about when you mention inclusionary zoning?
Director?
So inclusionary zoning doesn't specifically speak to that. That's really more looking at breaking down zoning areas that, and again, I'm a little out of my league here, but areas that are specifically for residential or single family or commercial, trying to make the zoning allow for more mixed income, mixed use. And so that's what that speaks to. But Councilman, your point about the tools that would help support long-term residents, clearly what Allison and Emily spoke to was about property tax increases. The other side of this is what really came out from Kayla's discussions with residents of a real interest in seeing that as development happens in their neighborhoods, they're able to benefit from that development, to be able to make repairs to their homes, to rehab their homes, to improve the parks in their areas. And that's what that community benefits agreement piece spoke to. It's something that we really are going to flesh out over the coming months as we look at the 10-year housing plan. But that essentially says that if a multifamily developer is building in a neighborhood, that they agree to a portion of their net operating income over, maybe 10, 15 years of the abatement to go into a housing trust fund. And then those housing trust fund dollars would be utilized within that neighborhood, right there, for residents to be able to apply to make those kind of improvements to their homes, or maybe broadly within the community, as we've talked to stakeholders, to make improvements to that neighborhood. So that, I think, speaks to that point and is really a good tool beyond just the affordable housing piece to look at helping homeowners make investments in their properties.
I would add one thing to that, Director Menes, and we've talked about a little bit about this in this project, and then some of the other work that we've done is a really critical tool for supporting existing housing stock and sort of bringing up the quality of it and making repairs and really finding a way to get capital to flow into these communities, right? So one of the things, if you look at the report itself, the amount of mortgage capital that's flowing into communities in Cleveland is very small, like almost non-existent in many parts of the city. Right? There is no mortgage capital flowing in. All the transactions are cash transactions. And that's just for sort of buying and selling homes. To actually be able to maintain the quality of your home, residents need low-cost loans, 0% interest, or grant, a combination between 0% interest and grant programs to provide them with enough capital to sort of put a new roof on, to fix the boiler, to get new windows, to maintain the stability of their housing. And that's a completely different set of issues. And the tax abatement doesn't have anything to do with it, but it goes a long way to sort of stabilizing the neighborhoods and finding a way to get lenders to lend to build and to rehab is really critical.
Thank you, Councilman.
And that's great news, because that's where I was getting at. How do we deal with that land trust? How do we actually bring more capital in to help some of these homeowners that are present? I would like to see, and this is something that hopefully we can talk about as a council, a couple of pilot areas that we could actually look at as how we can actually build that. I know that the Cleveland Foundation has worked with, I believe, my colleague, Councilman Jones, and others to do something similar in a small area in some of their areas, but I think we should identify a couple of areas where we could actually try to test that model, because that is critical. The other thing that I want to try to get to is, how do we deal with, determining where multifamily units are appropriate. Most of the people that are coming for tax abatements are coming for multifamily, more than 5 units. They're looking for 20, 25, 30, sometimes as high as 80 units. How do we look and use this as a tool to determine where we need to create more density? And I know you're talking with probably Director Collier, but how do we look at where we put these multifamily units and use the tax abatement tools compared to other areas where we know we need more development?
Director?
Well, and I think that's, Councilman, just what we really uncovered, right? Is that as we talked to stakeholders, and Allison had many of these stakeholder meetings, the unfortunate response was tax abatement alone is not going to encourage investment in neighborhoods beyond the hot neighborhoods with the cost of construction here, which is why we focus so hard on calling our 10-year plan, not just a housing plan, but a housing and investment plan, because it really speaks to what Mike had talked about, is that we don't have enough capital investment in our neighborhoods to incentivize the kind of development that you're speaking about. And we tend to have concentrated development in areas that are heating up, areas that maybe don't need further, quote, need. I think it's a little, we have to be careful about saying that from a market perspective. We need to help incentivize with other tools, development in other parts of the community, and that land trust model and looking at piloting things is a little bit of what we've started to do with the middle neighborhoods work of where can we test some of the lending products, where can we test some of the rehab housing products with our banking partners to keep the threshold of risk reasonably low at the beginning and to partner with our foundations to do so.
Thank you, Councilman.
Just two more things, Mr. President. I'm getting a disturbing amount of emails for some new developments that I'll leave unnamed until I can prove it, that are offering some of these new developments as Airbnbs. And what I would like to know is how should we, or what kind of recommendations would this committee, recommend to us that if somebody is not fulfilling their rental obligations or they're turning these into pretty much Airbnbs and hotels, how do we claw back that tax abatement that they are offered because they're not living up to their rental obligations or providing owner-occupied units? Is that something that you guys have looked at, or is that something we need to determine as a council?
Director, I know that there is a separate conversation going on about the short-term rentals, but do we have a clawback provision?
I would really have to talk to Director Donald in Building and Housing about that, but I'll take a note and circle back with you, Councilman.
I would just recommend, if we could, Mr. President, and I'm willing to talk with Councilman Brancatelli, who I know has a lot of extensive knowledge on this, and how we can put clawback provisions to anybody who received the tax abatement and has turned those apartment buildings into Airbnbs. I think we need to hold them accountable some kind of way. Last but not least, I didn't see opportunity zones mentioned in this. And how does this complement or support areas? I think it's 33 opportunity zones throughout the city of Cleveland. And how did you look at how tax abatements need to either complement or go in other places that opportunity zones are? How do you make that determination? Should they complement opportunity zones, or should we focus on sending tax abatements to other areas that are not part of the opportunity zones?
So, Councilman, I think a good way to look at this is the intent was the opportunity zones were supposed to be a layered tool, right? To incentivize development in areas where you largely weren't seeing it. And so that actually is the perfect combination with tax abatement, right? Is that the opportunity zone is identified as an area to attract investment because it hasn't received it, and then you layer tax abatement on top of it. In actuality, in practice, has that quite happened? As we see from the data, we're really seeing increasing investment in the same areas, and the opportunity zones haven't, at least to this point, done enough to attract further investment. It hasn't really allowed for that, but in theory, you wouldn't want to not have tax abatement in those opportunity zones. I'd welcome, Mike or Randy or someone else to speak to that who may have some experience in other cities where we could learn from that.
The trick with the opportunity zones and what sort of makes them attractive for developers is the prospect of an appreciating asset. And so there are only, when we look at the city of Cleveland, there aren't that many block groups in the city where you have real estate appreciation, right? And it's just roughly 6%, roughly. And so from a developer standpoint, they're probably not going to accrue the benefits that you would get from an opportunity zone, which sort of require you to hang in for a pretty long time, right, before you're able to write off the capital gains. And you're only going to get the benefit if you get capital gains. Right? And so if you're not getting a whole lot of appreciation on the asset that you're building, there's not a very strong incentive to build it. I mean, one of the things that we've seen with opportunity zones and where people are investing in them is they're right by hot markets or they're in hot markets, right, that haven't quite sort of popped yet, right? So they still were eligible for opportunity zone designation, but they were right next to sort of rapidly gentrifying areas, or the kinds of assets that you put in them are ones that you can be more confident are going to appreciate over time, right, because of the strength of the overall market.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
That's all I have, Mr. President. I think this is a great presentation. I would like, you know, I know we're in the age of Zoom, but I would love if at some point in time, I think it'd be good for some of our residents to be able to join in some of these presentations, and I'll be more than willing to host one of these sessions with you, Director, or one of your team members, because I really want our community to understand these tools, because I have a couple of high pressure areas that are really starting to feel the pressure and feel the heat of this development. So thank you, and thanks for this project.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Kevin Conwell.
Am I unmuted?
We're hearing you, Councilman.
All right, thank you very, very much. I reached out to Tanya Manaz, and I want to thank you for visiting my neighborhood. As you know, Tanya, that's one of the biggest concerns in the Glenville University Circle area is gentrification. And we know matter of fact, our area is growing. I mean, 60 to 70 houses, Mr. President. You visit the Glenville University Circle area, and the residents are very, very, we love to see the development, but as Councilmember Blaine Griffin and Councilmember Mike Polensek mentioned, I don't want my residents to be forced out who've been in Glenville since the Glenville riots. And if you were to visit the neighborhood again, I mean, it's a beautiful neighborhood. It's growing with houses, and we have a broad range of property that's being developed. Some going for 140,000, 150,000, and some homes are going for $300,000 and above. The comps there is very, very good, but what we are afraid of and is gentrification. We would love to have a property tax cap as well as property tax relief. Here's our biggest threat, Mr. President. When the state mandates the county to evaluate the Glenville University Circle area, we know with all this development and our comps being strong in the Glenville University Circle area, we know that taxes will be unaffordable to my residents. So with this tax cap, what do I have to do? What do my residents have to do to go downstate to testify for State Senator Sandra Williams? We will go down there in busloads to create a property tax cap for the Glenville University Circle area. Through the chair to Director Tanya Manaz.
Director?
So, Councilman, I think, you know, what we just spoke to with GOPC directly ties to what you were speaking to. We appreciate that you support the cap on the abatement above the 300,000. We do want to support rehab opportunities, right? That's naturally occurring affordable housing, and also very important in a neighborhood like yours to be able to encourage more rehab. But in terms of what you just said at the end there, I know we will look to you to support the work that's happening at the State House.
Director, you have people knocking on doors in my ward, and you know, I have a beautiful ward in the Glenville area, asking people to purchase their homes and telling them that within 2 to 3 years that their taxes are going to go up. Director, as you know, you visit the community, you talk with neighbors to neighbors. You know, my neighborhood is lovely. You see the economic development that is driving there. You see the road construction that's going on. Our comps will help drive the taxes up, and it's going to drive people out. That's a big risk. And it's like a catch-22. We have to build the community up. It's close to University Circle. We need to make Glenville and University Circle seamless. And we know when we build communities, we cut down on blight. We know that we cut down on crime issues. We know that more people will have more money in their pockets. It's all good. But the weakness is the property tax. The weakness is that we know that within 2 years, we need that tax relief. And I need you to show me this proposal that they just narrated. I need to take a better look at it. I need to study it. I need for you guys to visit neighbors to neighbors and sit back and have a conversation with the residents. We have to look at development and people as if people matter, as if people matter. You have to have inclusiveness in there. And reading this piece here, they said they interviewed residents, but did you interview any residents in my neighborhood where it's happening at? Through the chair to the director.
If we can have Emily and others talk, and Allison talk about the community engagement process and where you held those meetings. I got a free pass. I got to go into Councilman McCormick's ward to sit on one of the sessions. So if you can give a little bit of that background.
We can do that, but I would just ask that excuse me.
Sorry.
We want to get the questions answered. I'd like to get them answered as on point as possible and as efficiently as possible. It's 11:16. We still have our agenda ahead of us. So the councilman has a question. I will leave it to the director to determine who can best answer it if she can't. Director?
Okay, so I would just like Kayla Geschke just to speak very briefly to where the meetings were held so that Councilman Conwell gets that answered. And then I think Councilman, we'll send you the information because we really are interested in having you sign on and be an active participant in ensuring that those property tax protections do go through. But Kayla, if you could
As
just
you know, Director, I've already talked with, I practically live downstate. And
Absolutely.
I talked with some, you know that. I talked with State Representative Greenspan and my state representative, and I just looked over yesterday Sandra Williams' legislation. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece.
Great.
It's correlated to the Glenville University Circle area. That could be a test site when we can look at lessons learned for what's going on in the Glenville University Circle area and how we can make it seamless, but we keep people there, and as people matter. We got to put that in there.
Okay. Go ahead, Kayla, just briefly, please. Yes.
Sure, thank you, Director. Yeah, so the community meetings were held at 12 different locations across the city in the late fall, early winter, and some of them going into the beginning of this year. The one in Glenville was held at Third Space Action Lab. And we had a really good attendance at that meeting. Actually, I believe you stopped in.
I remember that. Yeah, you guys did. We were in National League of Cities when it happened. Yeah. My people tell me what's going on. You did. I'm listening.
Great.
That's where the meetings were held in your ward.
But Mr. President, when you host meetings and you put together a plan, you talk with the stakeholders and partners. That's number one. That's the residents. And they did a survey analysis also. So when you send me something, don't just send me the scope, but you send me the survey analysis also, what the residents were saying.
Yeah.
Through the chair to Emily.
Yeah, and so I'll just quickly respond. In the report, there's a whole section that Neighborhood Connections wrote that Kayla pulled together that really summarizes and then speaks to specific comments from residents in different areas. So I think you'll find that really instructive. And then as we wrap up, we'll send information about the 2 public meetings that Neighborhood Connections will be leading next week, Tuesday, August 4th and August 5th on Zoom. But we found that there's been great participation in those meetings and would invite you to come to those as well. The engagement will continue. Kayla's part of the team for the 10-year housing and investment plan doing the neighborhood outreach work. And it was really a testament to the fact that their team was such a good partner in this study that we wanted to continue that process and have continuity with our neighbors and residents through that.
So Director, here's my last point. I'll have Barbara Norton reach out to you about neighbors to neighbors, because we do need, you did the survey analysis, but the residents want to know, are they heard? And you have to give a progress review or progress update to the residents, because this tax cap piece, I'm going to sign on to it. And not only sign on to it, I plan to go down state to lobby other state reps and as well as state senators, because we had a conversation about it. The we is you and I. And that's where I'm at. Thank you very, very much. Give me the report. I do need to see that. And I do need to see the survey analysis. Thank you.
Thank Councilman Conwell. We have 5 more people on the list. 11:20, I'm going to go to Councilman Tony Brancatelli.
I'll pass on my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Going to Councilman Kerry McCormick, please.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Had to unmute myself there. Appreciate it. Just first, for the good of the order, a resident texted me and said I look like Councilman Slife, so I'll just take that as a compliment. But moving on from there, again, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I want to thank everyone who's been involved in this process and who's contributed to this. As was noted, a lot of hours put in by our residents, folks that build houses, developers, otherwise, that volunteered their expertise and their life experience. So again, thank you to them. As Councilman Zone noted earlier, really the impetus of this work amongst council and the the folks that have been working with us, at least from my perspective, is the question of how do we build out a robust affordable housing plan for the city of Cleveland that meets people of all different income levels, and how do we create quality affordable housing, which obviously to save time, I won't go into too much detail, Mr. President, but that overlaps with the work that this council has done and led and right to council and all sorts of different housing policies. So this piece today does not sit in a silo. It is very much connected with a lot of the work that we've done in the efforts to create more housing options for people of all income levels, in addition to what I think is one of the most underrated efforts that we've taken on with the mayor's administration around supporting not-for-profit lending practices in traditionally redlined areas, which I think is an extremely important element. And I hope that we increase our work in that space as well. So again, I see this as a piece of a larger puzzle to create a much more robust housing plan in the city of Cleveland. And I look forward to participating in that 10-year plan that we've talked about as well. A point of clarification, Chair to Director Maness. I read in the PowerPoint here that the recommendations here today are suggested to go into policy changes with a 10-year plan. I was unaware that that was being discussed. It was my understanding that these recommendations were to be acted on in the short term and not as a part of the 10-year plan. So looking for clarification on that from the director.
Director?
So through the chair to the councilman, so that's the recommendation from the research team that in looking at the strength of the housing stock in the city, and then now in light of COVID-19, that most of these recommendations on their own are probably not going to have the impacts and may, the longer term impacts that you just spoke to, and may also be more destabilizing than helpful just in this current environment, knowing that there'll be additional tools that could be layered on. These are recommendations. And now you begin looking at, as a city council and as administration, what might be most appropriate to do. As you said, I hope you all will be actively participating in the 10-year housing investment plan that has already kicked off and will be so in earnest in August and September. And that might help you get a sense of pacing and what makes sense to do. That lending that you just spoke to around CHN Housing Capital and more nonprofit and alternative lending tools is really critical as we think about layering on these tax abatement recommendations. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. I appreciate that. Chair to the director, I appreciate that response. I think that these recommendations are a good start, but they're quite frankly, I think low hanging fruit. So I would just hope that, as we move forward, we're not punting common sense revisions to this policy to put this plan on a shelf and say someday, somewhere, some council will think about these ideas. I mean, I'm joining this conversation because I believe it's the right thing to do, but my residents are ready to move forward with equitable housing legislation and equitable housing changes in the city of Cleveland, not in 2 to 5 years, but today, quite frankly. So I just wanted to, I know today we're not voting on anything. This is a review. I just want to get on the record saying that, it's my intention to move forward with these recommendations and not to let them sit on a shelf for 5 years. And that was, I think, what was expressed to the community, to the stakeholders, that we were going to work off of data, as I noted in the beginning, and we were going to work off of research, but that there'd be action, from this group. So, and that, if there is conversation around changing dynamics in the market or in the housing market, that as we've done all along, that be backed by data and not feelings. So just to put that on the record, as you noted, Director, too, thinking about items like our land bank, I want to just publicly shout out community development for the work that you've all done in coordination with my office and our residents, and I know other parts of the city, to utilize our land bank, our public land, in the name of equitable housing. And really that's a piece that falls a little bit outside of this specific study, but very much intertwined with it. The other thing, and again, I'm supportive of these recommendations as a start to a larger conversation, but that I just really want to emphasize, because it is what I am hearing every single day in my neighborhoods. Director, I've told you this story before, that I've sat in people's living rooms who've been crying because they've lived in Tremont and Ohio City and other areas I represent for years. They love the neighborhoods. And quite frankly, they're what I've heard is, look, I'm happy to hear to see that the house at the end of my street is no longer abandoned, and that, there's not the negative activity going on in it. But Cuyahoga County has raised my property bill by 200%, which, by the way, for the record, to echo off of Councilman Plensick, and I know that others have been in voices in this, I think is it's absurd that the property taxes did what they did last time around. Who can afford a 200-300% increase in their in the valuation of their homes? And obviously that was done by the county, not the city, but it's a huge problem. And again, this is not a theory. This is not a report. I've sat in people's living rooms as they've cried, telling me that they're losing their home or they have to leave because of the property tax issues that, I think were very poorly run through Cuyahoga County. So understanding that conversation requires, by law, state movement. It's something that I've, been annoying and pestering the entire time, Director, bringing it up at every meeting that we've had, but I really want to be supportive in any way possible with the statewide coalition to ensure that folks understand that this is a real issue in our community. The city of Cleveland has lost half of its population. We've got to encourage investment in our city, but I think it's incumbent upon us to do it in a smart way that's balanced, that allows for investment, and that also protects our long-term owner occupants. So that is top of mind to me, Director and Mr. Chairman and the members of the committee, that we really continue to stay focused on, whether it's Glenville or Ohio City or Larchmere or wherever, that we are focusing to support and protect our long-term owner occupants, so that they have all the right in the world to stay in the neighborhood that they've loved for many years, right? And we've got to make sure that they're able to do that. And I think the increase in property tax issue is so fundamentally key to this conversation. And I'm really excited that we've got so many smart people locally and also from the statewide level that are focusing on that. And I appreciate the document with the petition or form that we're putting forth. I'm going to send that out to my folks in the community today to make sure they sign on to that. But I really want to highlight that, Director, because honestly, I hear about that more than I do a lot of these other issues. So, yeah.
And Council President, I know you want to move on, but I just want to be clear very much so on these recommendations that we need to operationalize them, right? So things like the community benefits agreement, the additional information we need to be able to operationalize that will come through the 10-year housing plan. So trust me, we didn't do this to sit on anybody's shelf. And then some of the recommendations are specifically applicable to some of our hot neighborhoods, which are yours, as you pointed out, and Councilman Conwell's and Councilman Zone's. And so those would be appropriate places to do some trial work and to begin moving this forward. So I wanted to reiterate that. And then, as you said, we've got Linda and Emily and Allison on this call. They're really leading the charge at the state level, and it's the time to have the city's council be actively engaged in that. So we heard that across the board at the meetings as well.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, my last comment, I mean, again, I look forward to being a part of the housing conversation because we really need to put forth a much more aggressive affordable housing and equitable housing plan for the city of Cleveland. From a safe and quality housing perspective. As you know, Director, we've held 40 land bank lots between Ohio City and Tremont for 4 or 5 years now in order to put infill housing in the neighborhood that is not market rate, that quite frankly reaches a different income level, lower income level for folks that need that housing. But from a citywide strategy, I look forward to that conversation because now more than ever, we've got to be bullish on housing options for people of all income levels in our city. So I appreciate this step along the way, and I look forward to the implementation of these recommendations and to the continued work. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Charles Slife.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm setting a timer because I know that I talk a lot.
What are you setting it for? I've got one going.
I'm setting a stopwatch, so just
Okay.
to keep myself honest. So,
Okay,
but I'll go quick. Director, in the report, it's noted that 92% of abatements since 2004 were for either a single family or a residential condo. Is there any data on who the recipient, not the land use type, but who received it, whether it was John and Jane Doe, the family, or it was a developer who ultimately passed it on to a household?
So we can send you some of that raw data. I don't know, Mike, if you want to speak to how much of that we really differentiated in the study. I think it was really mostly single family, just knowing that it was a single family home.
And we can't really know from the data that we received.
Okay, my suspicion is that there's a high skew towards developers. And if you look from 2011 forward, I counted on the map, there were maybe 20 tax abatements west of 117th Street. That's all of Ward 17, 16, and a good chunk of 11. So that's a huge portion of the city. And I'm not confident that the average homeowner knows how to go through this process. And I think that there's this perception out there that things get flagged in City Hall along the way and departments talk to each other. So surely, if someone's they just hire a general contractor, they're doing some work to their house, it'd be great if the building department was able to say, hey, just so you know, before we approve this, if you did X, Y, or Z, you could actually, which would add to your cost, but you get abatement on the back end. I would love for that mechanism to be in place, and I think that that's an example of good government. So the degree to which that tool can be built into these conversations, as well as others, I think that'd be important.
And Councilman, the only thing I'll mention is one of the significant focus areas of our department is to try to encourage more rehab, because that's really where individuals benefit. Yeah.
Put a pin in that real quick. The 30% of one's income on housing, what's the origin of that percentage? Where do we get that from? To me, it seems high.
That's a HUD stipulated threshold for housing cost burden that is typically used. Extreme housing cost burden is usually 50% of your income being used for mortgage. And it's really much more applicable for folks at the lower end of the income distribution, because someone who makes $10,000 a month, they're paying 30% of their income on a mortgage. It's not really the same burden on them as someone who's making $1,200 a month, right?
Thank you. Well, not to question the brain trust at HUD, but I think between childcare and medical bills and student loans, there's so much that people have on their plate, and I don't think that 30% of your income is a good standard of what one's actual disposable income is towards housing. And I can tell you, when, you know, my wife and I got pre-approved for our mortgage, they did not consider our student loans. And that shocked us. You know, I won't go beyond that, but I want to make sure that whatever metrics we're using, if we need to kind of create our own metrics to the degree possible, I think that we need to be setting people up so that they're not spending more than they need to, or that we're taking into their, you know, the entire budget that they have as they are working through homes. Back to Director Manessa's point on renovation, you know, older homes need attention. And the calls that I get so many calls about, you know, the city tree messed up the sidewalk and now the resident has to pay for the sidewalk, or the city tree broke my sewer line and now I've got a $10,000 sewer bill. And I appreciate why we have green standards built into this. Green standards are important, but the improvements that I'm seeing residents do in my neighborhood that, you know, are critical as foundation work, new driveways, tearing down a 50-year-old garage and rebuilding it. And all of these things, they cost a lot of money. They require financing, but they don't qualify for tax abatement. And it's great that they're being done. They raise the property value, but then on the back end, your taxes go up. And what the perception is that the city incentivizes new development in parts of the city, but almost disincentivizes investing in your older property elsewhere. And I think that this is a particularly problematic issue in these middle neighborhoods that we've been talking about. And, you know, don't tell my 7th grade teacher, but I did some algebra. I said I never would. For what you pay in taxes in Cleveland for a $150,000 house, you can get a $210,000 house in Lorain County, same tax bill. So to me, what I'm seeing people say is, why should I pay $10,000 for a new driveway? You know, it's just easier to cut bait, sell my home, and go somewhere else. And, you know, the next person can worry about the driveway because the house is only 10 years old. I think these are things that we need to build into our housing plan and make sure that we're not, what ways are we intentionally or unintentionally being punitive for people who inherently are going to have some hidden costs in home ownership just because we have an older housing stock. And I don't see that within the recommendations. Councilman McCormick mentioned that this is the beginning of a process. So I'd like for there to be a deeper conversation of if it's tax abatement or some other way that we can make sure that people are investing in their homes, because you can only, you know, repeat that cycle that I mentioned so many times before you start to see, you know, even more population decline in areas of the city that we've always assumed are just going to kind of be stable. But unfortunately, legacy costs are kind of coming to a head. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Madzone?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a brief reaction to what I heard and then a suggestion. As my colleagues, as you can see, this is incredibly difficult and complicated conversation. Too often when we engage with our constituency or we engage with people in the development sector, they look at it from a simplistic lens, and it really takes a nuanced approach to explaining all of the challenges and pressures that confront housing policies in cities. You know, I do represent parts of my district are high pressure areas, but that wasn't the case just 25 years ago. It was among the poorest, impoverished, high crime-ridden areas on the west side of Cleveland. We worked really hard as a community to stabilize the neighborhood and to create confidence that people wanted to buy homes here and build new homes in this community. And now it's caught up to us. And so I think these recommendations, these 6 recommendations, will give us the toolkit that is a first start. It's not a complete portfolio of resources we can use, but it's a start on what we can do, again, to making sure that we can have equitable communities. My suggestion is, and so I'll pose this question to the director, and if anyone on the consultant team wants to respond, but I pose this question not only, and I want a response from Director Maness, but I pose this to my council colleagues and to you, Council President, as the chair of our Finance Committee. One of the recommendations talks about multi-unit buildings that are exceed $5 million in high pressure census tracts that we work towards developing these community benefits agreement. Up until this point, the city really has been at an arm's length with the community benefits agreement. The administration has communicated, and I've heard the mayor say this many times, he believes that it's better that it's negotiated between a community, whether it's a nonprofit, a faith-based institution, or just people on in a community to try to negotiate a good outcome. I don't want to walk away or dissolve the city's involvement in this process. We have extraordinary leverage in engaging the development sector. So I believe we need to do more work in this space around community benefits agreement. Director, I have a follow-up, but Director Maness, just any thoughts or reaction to that comment about community benefit agreements?
So one of the things that we'll look at is sort of best practice in terms of other cities that have implemented these agreements, in terms of where, I think you'd want the influence from the local community, of course, and the council person, but how they're best administered, because looking to see sort of what the appropriate place is for the city administration to play. I think they've been successful where it's coming up through the community, so that, and I know you're not saying to get away from that, where it's more about, what does the neighborhood need? But then understanding how it may best be administered. I hear you, I just don't have a good response for you at this point.
And just my follow-up would be through the chair to the director and to my colleagues. We have to be very careful as individual council members on how these are negotiated. And I don't believe, this is my own personal opinion, that we could have a cookie cutter approach to how you engage people on this particular matter, because all neighborhoods have unique characteristics. And so I'm just planting that as a flag, saying that we have more work to do in this space. And I look forward to being a part of a long-term solution that creates communities of strengths. Just my last comment would be one thing that Councilwoman Cleveland always reminded us in our city, and what this report yielded, is that if we're going to drive economic development into other parts of the city that have historically been left out of development, we need a strong tax abatement program, and we need an initiative like this. And I appreciate Majority Leader Cleveland's comments in our meeting. I just want to acknowledge that really resonated, hit home with me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Joe Jones? Same issue, Councilman, if you could.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I just want to thank the director, and I want to thank the administration for putting this together. This is something that has been near and dear to me from entering city council, talking about a housing plan. And I started it and dealing with a development scenario in my neighborhood. And it came at a time also when the discussion was, why is it that we see development downtown, hundreds of millions of dollars invested there and to the tunes of billions, and then we see on the west side hundreds of millions invested in some certain neighborhoods on the west side of town, and then we see University Circle, billions of dollars invested there, and yet when it comes to our neighborhoods, especially like Ward 1, for an example, investments is skipped over. We did not even get an opportunity zone. And so I really appreciate the fact that, the administration has sought to put together this plan. And what I think, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, is I'd like to see it to be fair and equitable. When I served then under Mayor Mike White, the City of Cleveland's council and the mayor joined partnership and created Neighborhoods First program. So there was fair investment across the entire board. So if you saw development and housing development, say for an example, like what is going on in Matt Zone's neighborhood, where they're just exploding between the seams, they're developing, even the sewers, they're developing them out into condos. So every little inch of land and place is being developed out. And when we had neighborhoods first, all of the neighborhoods in the city of Cleveland could develop out a project working with their local development corporations. And so, Mr. President, I'd ask the director, you know, when we look at the city of Cleveland, is one of the things that I've talked about in the past when I once served over 14 years ago on the council, was our development corporations, because they're our fundamental foundation to help us develop out our neighborhoods. You have some development corporations, like, i.e., for an example, Matt Zone's neighborhood. I use his because his has done most of the development. He's had Detroit Shoreway, which is a very strong, solid development corporation. But when you look over in Ward 1, where we once had 3 development systems, we only have 1, which is more or less a service-oriented development institution. But we don't have the same kind of tools in our toolbox as, say, for an example, development, Detroit Shoreway. So how do we begin the process to not only have the tools in our toolbox for the housing program, which I think is really a great start, Mr. President, to the director. How do we begin the process to make it fair and equitable to have a strong development corporation system across the entire landscape of the entire city of Cleveland, not just picking and choosing?
Director, do you understand his question, and can you give him some response?
I do, and I understand and would agree that one of the real areas of focus for our department is trying to stabilize the community development system, and we're focused on the southeast side of the city, which includes your area, Councilman, in terms of building development capacity in Harvard Services Center. So absolutely, I hear you, I agree, and it's something that we're in process to try to do.
And Mr. President, one of the things that also I've been championing at the table, and I know I've had discussions with you, me and Mr. McCormick and Barshir Jones have always talked about this issue too. When it looks at how sluggish our economy locally recovers on a national level, it's like we're always behind. And so, Mr. President, to the director, why is it that the city of Cleveland, even in the slides presented today, we find ourselves always behind the national norm, and in some instances so far behind that it seems like it would take forever to catch up?
So, Director, if you can answer that, and then if we can, from this point, if we kind of stay with, okay, but Council, let me talk please for a sec, please. If the director can answer that, but I'd like to stay away from kind of philosophical questions and stick to the report, because we still have our legislative agenda ahead of us. So if you could attempt that, Director, and then back to you, Councilman Jones.
So, Councilman, I think you've posed a very broad question that has a lot to do with the health of Northeast Ohio's economy. And unfortunately, the fact that as we've moved from a more industrial economy to more information-based, the city, like many other cities in the Midwest, has struggled, and you kind of see that recovery has been slower in the Midwest more broadly. We've also spoken to the fact that we experienced a great deal of sprawl in Northeast Ohio, so the investments from a government perspective have been spread in ways that are challenging. One of the best things we can do, and Councilman Slice spoke to this, is give people a reason to want to live in Cleveland, to stay in Cleveland, to move to Cleveland, and the tools that we'll be developing that have been recommended here through the tax abatement study and then through the 10-year housing plan I feel strongly, as the market recovers, will make us competitive. And that's really what we want to be, is be able to compete in our market.
Councilman?
And Mr. President, the significance of asking that question is we need to find out, we need to know fundamentally, I heard what the director said in her answer, but we need to do a study on that. We need to find out how we shore up the city of Cleveland so we're not always in last as it relates to economic recoveries. I think that's significant, important to the overall health of our city and stability of our city. And I would, say, looking at investments and what was talked about in terms of tax abatement and our financial institutions and having incentives on there, it seems like we are not getting the investments out of our banks. And, as I started into this, me, Barshir Jones, Mr. McCormick talked about our financial institutions in the city of Cleveland. We have some of them that are are very active in helping us out as a city in terms of investing. And then we have some that are not doing not enough. And the reason why I asked this question, Mr. Chairman, because I've had to deal with developers coming into my neighborhood, and they couldn't get any investors in the city of Cleveland, financial institutions, to invest in developing housing. And so they couldn't find anyone in the state of Ohio to help them in investing in housing. So they had to bring outside bank and financial institutions outside of the city, outside of the state, in order to invest in our city. And I think, Mr. Chairman, having billions of our tax-paying dollars in these financial institutions in our city, they should invest back into the city of Cleveland. And so the question is, Director, why is it that our financial institutions do not want to invest into our own city to keep our city stable?
Councilman, I'm going to just ask that if you have that conversation with the director offline and keep our questions to the report, that question could
Mr.
be.
Chairman, I think it's germane to the
Councilman,
situation
well, right now, because I'm the chair.
We're talking about investment in the Black neighborhood. And
Councilman, if you would listen for just a second, that is a question that's not, it could be the subject of its own committee hearing, and it could consume hours in terms of CRA and reinvestment. Right now, I'd like to focus on the report, and we're going to end this portion of this at 12 o'clock, regardless of where we're at. So if you have questions on the report.
well, Mr. Chairman, it's just like every time I have to speak, and I'm going to say this, you and Matt Zone want to always cut me short while you allow the other members to speak longevity. Now, I don't have no problem with the director and answering this question offline, but it is a big elephant in the room. Our program won't move forward if we don't have our local institutions investing back into the city of Cleveland, as they should. And so that's the whole point here, Mr. Chairman. And so I would appreciate when we do this, some of our colleagues have talked about this, open this up so that the public can have full input in on this issue. And I really appreciate the work that the director is doing. But I believe, Mr. Chairman, this is not just us. It should be all of Cleveland. All of us should be buying into the city of Cleveland, everyone. And if we have that kind of mentality, we can change the conditions and it won't be so lopsided. And so with that being said, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your leadership, but, and I know we had to move this agenda, and I'm going to yield the floor to you for that. But I would love to also sit down. I think Mr. Norton's presentation, I love everything he had to say. I'd like to sit down as a council member on this committee and participate in being a part of it, and would like to get all the materials, Mr. Chairman. Can we make that happen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And so when is the next committee meeting? I'd like if the director could, invite me to it so I can be there present, so I won't be sitting at the table. I can sit back in the back, understand how you're doing what you're doing, and then have the kind of input needed so that I can fully represent the total interest of my neighborhood in particular and the city of Cleveland in general, because I care about the entire city and I care about the neighborhood in particular.
Thank you. Thank you. If you would contact the councilman, I'd appreciate it, Director.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay,
President.
to wrap up and tell us next steps, I just want to turn to Councilman Brancatelli, then we're going to go back to our legislative agenda. Councilman Brancatelli?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we'll be sure that Director Maness and the team gets out our next couple of sessions in August that are going to be up, so folks will have an opportunity to participate and see what's going on. I just wanted to wrap up with a couple quick points, and I think as the Director talked about, that tenure study is a big part of what we're looking at, and being able to layer in middle neighborhoods, and as Councilman Slife talked about, looking at these different abatements and what works and doesn't work within certain neighborhoods. And those smaller abatements, quite frankly, don't work. And abatements actually start at $2,500, if you believe that, in the state. But it's just not worth sowing that to try and get a tax abatement, because we're only talking about pennies then. And because abatements are the added value. So it's not abatement for all the property value. It's only the added value. So when you're doing rehab, that's why it's more difficult to do abatements when you're just doing remodeling jobs. But I did want to point out, one of the issues that were raised and what the study points out is that there is a significant amount of affordable housing throughout our region. And I think that the study outlined in 2018 that 61% of arm's length transactions of sales in the city were under $50,000. and 34% were under $25,000. So we do have affordable housing throughout our city that are transferred to arm's length transactions. And I think just to reemphasize that the amount of millions of dollars that it's adding back to our tax base as it burns off in 2018, and then the study goes on to talk about 2035, is significant. We are adding a significant amount of tax base to our neighborhood role. So it is important. And then I think the other, just reemphasize that there was a question around expiring abatements and foreclosures, and that the study found that there was no relationship between expiring abatements and tax foreclosures, and that it wasn't a significant point to raise. But what was significant was that there was no consistent relationship on displacement. So that notion that we're displacing lots of people, I think that the notion of having the loop program and preserving housing values, as Councilman Zone and McCormick pointed out, is real. And I think that's what we have to work on a state level and a county level. But the displacement pressure is not that high, only 2% of the market. So I think those are important. The one question I would have to Mr. Norton, I think, in part of the study, which is worth talking about, it mentions that a big issue is our income is part of a concern. Income is not matching when we look at the valuations, but also the other pressures on the homeowners and the elevated housing costs, which we cannot discount. When you look at raising water rates, raising sewer rates, when we talk about trash collection, all the different fees that get associated with homeownership, the one thing that stands out in the report is from 2006 to 2014, in those 12 years, our CMSD millage went from 29 to 52.69. And that added $415 a year to a $50,000 valuation. So when we talk about increased taxes, it's not the pressure from abatement, it's other elevated housing costs that's adding to that. So if you want to look at where we're seeing the pressure that's coming to our homeowners, it's coming from the inside millage, the outside millage, it's coming from a lot of other different sources as well. So I think as we go through this study and as we go into the next 10-year plan, I think those are the important things we want to take in consideration as we're working through this. So I think it's important that we all read the study thoroughly and understand those components to it. And see where we are seeing some of the added pressures, but still looking at being able to have equitable housing throughout our region is critically important. So I just wanted to make a few points before we closed out, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you, Councilman Frank. I thank all of our presenters for Councilman Jones rejoined us. Councilman, do you have anything as we wrap? Did you want to speak as we wrap up, Councilman Bashir Jones?
Yeah. I just really wanted to highlight what Councilman Griffin, Conwell, and a few others have said in regards to just making sure that we have a plan to deal with those who already have houses. One of my biggest issues is people are excited about the new development, but they're also concerned that they're being left out of the conversation. So I just wanted to make sure that I highlighted that we don't, want to just hear a plan, but we also want to, see something very, very, successful. So that's all I wanted to say, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Councilman. And again, I want to thank the director and our presenters. There'll be much more conversation. Again, we're not taking a vote on this. This is a step in the process. So look forward to continuing to work with everybody. So thank you all very much. Is Director Gordon with us? I see that she is muted. Okay, Director Gordon, we're going to go back to ordinance number 524-2020 as amended. Councilmembers Bashir Jones, Blaine Griffin, Bashir Jones, Brent Kelly, Kelly Harrison, emergency ordinance to supplement codified ordinance of Cleveland, Ohio, 1976 by enacting new section 241.43 related to the sale of beverages offered with children's meals by service operations. The amendments this had a thorough hearing, and there was 2 amendments of interest. In section 1, at section 241.43B, strike 130 calories and insert 150 calories in increasing the caloric content of the drinks. And in line 2, strike 6 ounces and insert 8 ounces. Second amendment is in section 1, new section 241.43E2, strike 10 days and insert 30 days, and strike the director's decision on appeal shall be final, and insert a person aggrieved by a final decision may make further appeals to the Board of Zoning Appeals within 30 days after the director's decision. So I would like to hear from Director Gordon, then I'll hear from the sponsors, and we'll have questions, comments on this. Hopefully people had an opportunity to tune in on Monday for the discussion for the Health Committee, because it was very, very informative and very got a lot of good work done. Director Gordon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Today, we're hearing again ordinance number 524, 2020, where by City Council and also the Health Department worked with a number of community agencies, including the American Heart Association, to begin what is very important work in making sure that young people have healthy options to make sure that they have a healthy start. And so one way to do this is to work with food operators, restaurants, et cetera, in making sure that children's menus include healthy options. This ordinance relates solely to beverages offered with children's menus. As the committee knows, I'm quite concerned about the food options that are provided on children's menus, and think that that needs to also be included and will be our continuous work moving forward. But this allows an opportunity for the healthy choice to be the optimal choice in terms of beverages to go with children's meals. The Division of Environment and the Food Safety Program will be working with operators and looking at menus to make sure that they are aware of why this ordinance is put in place and what kind of options they have available to them to provide for young people. There are also a number of partner agencies who will be engaged with this in terms of community education and working with food operations so as to make sure that that loop is closed and that that communication and all of that information can be provided to those operators. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. And before I go to the council members, I just want to just make an observation that this really was a great exercise in really reaching out to all the affected parties and coming up with a very good ordinance for those partners that were involved. Not everybody got everything that they had asked for, but everybody was listened to, and a much better ordinance was crafted. I said on Monday at a meeting of council presidents that Councilman Zone set up with National League of Cities, I always remember the council president of Philadelphia saying that their beverage ordinance almost killed him. He said it was just like one of the worst things that they had to go through, and it was contentious and it was rough. And looking at this, I just really want to commend the chair and the sponsors and everybody that participated in this, because this is really how legislation should be done. With that, I'll turn to the chair of our Health Committee and sponsor, Councilman Blaine Griffin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I'd also like to thank Rachel Scalish for really helping us, shepherding us through this process, our council attorney, because we went through several iterations of this legislation. I would tell you that, Mr. Chair, I agree with you. I commend the partners. Just to give a brief background, Neighborhood Leadership Institute, which is an organization that I helped co-found as a community organizer back in the day, along with the American Heart Association, met with me about a year and a half ago, and they wanted to try to do something about sugary drinks in our community. And, you know, they gave me the facts and the data that really showed that we had a problem with children with obesity. Over 30% of our children that live in the city of Cleveland are obese, which we know leads to a lot of health problems in the future, which also contributes to health disparities and other issues. So I want to commend the fact that the Ohio Restaurants Association, the Ohio Beverage Association, and the milk producers, as well as representatives from McDonald's and also several others, were able to come together and support this ordinance based on impact, to make sure that they weren't inadvertently disproportionately impacted. But at the heart of this is all about children. and all about how we want to make sure that we do whatever we can as this 133rd council to give children a healthy start. So this health committee and this council and myself has been committed to this. I'd like to thank all of the co-sponsors that signed on to this. And once again, I think this was a rigorous process that yielded a great piece of legislation that our children will benefit from. If a parent does want to get a pop or something for their child, they can request it. But the default menu will be water, juice, 100% juice, milk. So what we're trying to do is create better habits, and we're trying to change culture in the city of Cleveland. Ladies and gentlemen, I grew up, McDonald's was a luxury. And I know that I'm dating myself when I say that, but when I grew up, McDonald's was a luxury. Burger King and all of these other things were a luxury. So we really need to get into some rigorous standards that we put in place in order to make sure we support our youth and our young people. This is not a government overreach. And once again, all of the industries really signed on to this. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. I'd like to do the other original sponsor, Councilman Bashir Jones. Not hearing from Councilman Jones, I'll begin now with Councilman Mike Polensek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, my honorable colleagues. I'd like to again commend everyone who's been involved in this process. I just want some clarification to respond from Rachel Scala, if possible, just to respond to some of these emails that I have received. This is strictly an option. It is not being forced upon anyone who enters a fast food business or a restaurant. This is an option that there be other items, beverages on the menu, correct?
Through the chair to the councilman, this ordinance requires the restaurants to offer first, if they have children's meals, to offer as a beverage, either milk, water, or 100% fruit juice. That is a requirement.
Right.
If the purchaser wants to have a beverage other than those three items, then they may ask for it and buy one.
That's exactly, that's where I'm just trying to, I was trying to respond to some of these people, folks who emailed me, vindicated that somehow this is being mandated and forced upon parents. It is not, it's an option. And I think we have to make that clear. It gives parents a healthy option for their children when they go into a restaurant or fast food establishment, et cetera. And again, is trying to stress the fact that we want parents, and I'm a father of 5, grandfather of 3, want to make sure that they are getting a healthy option when they go into a restaurant or carry-out establishment. That's all. What the action that we're taking today is just that. We're not forcing something down someone's throat. That's what I want to make sure people understand.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Joe Jones.
Mr. President, to my colleagues, Blaine Griffin, and as well as to the administration and Bashir Jones, who is a co-sponsor to this piece of legislation. I think that this is great. It's a good beginning, a good start to, in terms of making sure that we have options and healthy options and choices to our young people. We know that a part of a person's diet affects an impact on their health. And I just want to commend my colleagues for introducing this piece and the administration for making that necessary amendment change. And so I just want to thank all those who are involved, and I have no unreadiness in passing this piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Brian Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, to Director Gordon or Rachel, was there a study done, or is there any type of information out there that we have for eateries or restaurants that already do not provide this?
The forms are there.
Director or one of our sponsors, can anybody answer that question?
If I understand the question correctly, and if he could restate it, I think he said, is there a number of restaurants that already do this that are in place? Is that what you're asking?
Correct. I mean, has anybody done any research on whether or not restaurants don't already provide water, milk, or juice?
So the Ohio Restaurants Association, as well as McDonald's Corporation, as well as the Ohio Beverage Association, did give us some data when we were actually developing the piece of legislation. And there are a very limited amount of places like those that actually offer these kids' meal menus. However, there are some that are throughout the city that have to change, and specifically McDonald's, Burger King, and those large chains that offer kids menus as well.
Thank you.
And part of it, if I could, Mr. Chair, just to follow up on that, was one of the reasons why we had them at the table, because we wanted to make sure we understood how this will affect their supply chain and those other things, because we don't want to inadvertently create a hardship for some of these businesses. And that's one of the reasons why we made a couple of the amendments, like the move from 6.7 ounces or 6 ounces to 8 ounces. So we've had that discussion, a rigorous discussion in committee, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. If there are no further questions and we have additional sponsors asked to be added at Health Committee, they're all on here as well. Brancatelli, Kelly, Harrison. If anybody else wants to be on, let me know. Councilman Joe Jones. With that, if the Councilman Mike Polensek, if there are no further questions, ordinance number 52420 as amended stands approved. We'll be considering this in a few minutes. Is anybody on the call from planning? Councilman Brancatelli, do you know how critical 50620 is?
I'm not sure the timeline on this. I know it's an ongoing study and it's an extension of the study, so it's not a new study. So I suspect we can hold this for a couple of weeks for our August meeting, because we're extending the contract.
Right. So we'll hold 50620 until our next council meeting. If there's nothing else for the good of the order, we're going to adjourn for 10 minutes. I would ask people not to turn their screens off, to stay on the same invitation. And the council meeting will start, we'll say the council meeting will start at 12, let's say 12:25.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to take this moment before we adjourn this meeting to acknowledge your major award that you won. We did have our Pierogi Dash, which was virtual, and I'm concerned about the deep state known as Channel 20 that seemed to circumvent what we tried to set up, which was having a virtual dash that we were promoting in our community. And I thought I was going to win that race. I thought I did win that race, because here's me crossing the finish line, which I thought was first. But then I realized that you got there before me and you finished first, and you were able to take home the award. So congratulations on winning the Pierogi Dash again this year for the 10th straight year. And thank you for supporting our community activities.
Thank you. And one of these years, you'll come up with a category that I can't defeat. So, all right. Well, thank you, Councilman. And if there's nothing else for the good of the order, Committee of the Whole is adjourned. We will begin the council meeting at 12:25. Thank you. Okay, so here is, with my mask on,
Somebody's absent.
So, Pat, I'm assuming that we need to be able to see the faces for quorum. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
Okay. Okay, here we go. 1, 2. I've got 10. 11. Is that your comment, Madam Clerk?
11.
I have 12 by 13.
13.
Okay. Well, let's get started then. Let's begin the council meeting Wednesday, July 19th, 2020. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Kelly.
Here.
Bishop.
Please unmute everybody. I'll do it. Got it.
Francatelli.
Here.
Cleveland.
Here.
Conwell. Pearson.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Bashir Jones.
Here.
Joe Jones.
Here.
Casey.
Present.
McCormack.
Present.
Mooney.
Here.
Clinton. Santana. Slight.
Present.
Zone.
Present.
You have a quorum, Mr. President.
Thank you. If everybody could please pause for a moment of silence, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic
For which it stands,
one
one
nation,
nation,
under
under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. This council meeting is being held during the COVID-19 emergency declaration and is being conducted as a virtual meeting in accordance with Ohio's open meeting laws as amended by Sub-House Bill 197. Council Rule 49 requiring the attendance of mayors and directors of all departments at council meeting is waived for this and other virtual meetings held under amended Sub-House Bill 197. In compliance with the charter and the rules of council, a copy of all legislation to be heard during this council meeting was furnished previous to the meeting to every council member through their council email. It is hereby acknowledged without objection that members of council have received this legislation. Further, council members must be visibly present for all votes. If you're not present, your vote will not be counted. Madam Clerk, please dispense with the journal.
By Councilmember Polensek, that the reading of the minutes of the last meeting be dispensed with the journal approved. Seconded by Councilmember Griffin.
Communications.
File number 589, 2020. Dedication plat for Colfax Family Homes re-subdivision at 6925 Colfax Road. Approved by committees on municipal services and properties and development planning and sustainability. Without objection, plat approved. File number 590, 2020. Dedication plat for Colfax Family re-subdivision at 7115, 7118, and 7204 Colfax Road. Approved by committees on municipal services and properties and development planning and sustainability. Without objection, plat approved.
First reading emergency ordinances to be referred for administrative and committee review.
Ordinance 592, 2020 by council members McCormack, Johnson, Brancatelli, and Kelly by departmental request. An emergency ordinance authorizing Director of Capital Projects or Public Works to enter into one or more agreements with Cleveland Cuyahoga County Port Authority for improvements to Irishtown Bend and Franklin Avenue, and authorizing the Commissioner of Purchases and Supplies to acquire, accept, and record all property necessary. Ordinance 597, 2020 by council members Griffin, Brancatelli, and Kelly by departmental request. An emergency ordinance authorizing Director of Community Development to enter into an agreement with CHN Housing Capital to provide grants and forgivable and non-forgivable loans to property owners to administer interim controls to make their residences lead safe for a period of 5 years. Ordinance 598, 2020 by council members Polensek, Johnson, and Kelly by departmental request. An emergency ordinance authorizing the mayor to apply to the District 1 Public Works Integrating Committee and accept funding for the rehabilitation of East 185th Street from Nottingham to Pawnee, authorizing Director of Capital Projects to apply for and accept gifts, grants, and other funding, and to enter into contract with AECOM Tech Services for engineering and architectural services and other agreements, authorizing the Commissioner of Purchases and Supplies to acquire, accept, and record for right-of-way purposes real property and easements, giving consent of the City of Cleveland to the Ohio Director of Transportation for the improvement and authorizing the Director to enter into local project administration agreements with the State of Ohio and cause payment to the State of Ohio for the city's share of the improvement. Ordinance 599, 2020 by council members McCormack, Casey, Brancatelli, and Kelly by departmental request. An emergency ordinance authorizing the Commissioner of Purchases and Supplies to sell city-owned property no longer needed for public use located near the northwest corner of Wadsworth Avenue and West 44th Street to Community Rebuilders LLC for the purposes of future redevelopment.
First reading emergency ordinances to be passed.
Ordinance 593, 2020 by councilmember Casey. An emergency ordinance authorizing the Director of Department of Community Development to enter into agreement with Bel Air Curitas Development Corporation for the West 140th Berea Art Beautification Project through the use of Ward 16 casino revenue funds. Ordinance 594, 2020 by councilmember Polensek. An emergency ordinance authorizing Director of Department of Public Works to enter into an agreement with Cleveland Metro Parks for the Villa Angela Park Swimming Beach Project through the use of Ward 8 casino revenue funds. Ordinance 595, 2020 by councilmember McCormack. An emergency ordinance authorizing Director of Department of Community Development to enter into an agreement with Ohio City Incorporated for the Market Square Park Project through the use of Ward 3 casino revenue funds. Ordinance 596, 2020 by councilmember Zone. An emergency ordinance authorizing the Director of City Planning Commission to enter into an agreement with Detroit Shoreway Community Development Organization for the RTA bus shelter project through the use of Ward 15 casino revenue funds.
Read the motion to suspend the rules.
By councilmember Polensek, that the rules be suspended and the legislation just read be placed on final passage. Seconded by councilmember Griffin.
Please call the roll.
Kelly, Bishop, Brancatelli, Cleveland, Conwell, Griffin, Hairston, Johnson, Bashir Jones, Joe Jones, Casey, McCormack, Mooney, Polensek, Santana, Slight, Zone. 13 yeas.
Thank you. Please call the roll on passage.
Kelly, Bishop, Brancatelli, Cleveland, Conwell, Griffin, Hairston, Johnson, Bashir Jones, Joe Jones, Casey, McCormack, Mooney, Polensek, Santana, Slight, Zone. 14 yeas.
Thank you. First reading ordinances referred for administrative and committee review.
Ordinance 620, 2020 by Councilmember Slight. An ordinance replacing a 25-foot specific mapped setback from the property line with a 7-foot specific mapped setback from the property line along the eastern side of Rocky River Drive between Sedalia Avenue and Milgrave Avenue.
Before we go to first reading, resolutions referred for administrative and committee review, a number of us communicated on a House Bill 6 resolution. It may say for passage. I put it for introduction because I want to have hearings on it, because I think that there's I think the corruption is not limited to Columbus. So with that, first reading resolutions referred for administrative and committee review.
Resolutions, excuse me, Resolution 605, 2020 by council members Kelly, Slight, Bashir Jones, Griffin, Polensek, Zone, Bishop, Conwell, Cleveland. An emergency resolution urging the immediate repeal of HB 6.
First reading emergency resolutions to be adopted.
Resolution 591, 2020 by Councilmember Kelly, an emergency resolution fixing the date of the next regular meeting of council. Resolution 601, 2020 by Councilmember Polensek, an emergency resolution objecting to the renewal of a C1, C2 liquor permit at 870 East 185th Street. Resolution 602, 2020 by Councilmember Brancatelli, an emergency resolution objecting to the renewal of a C1, C2 liquor permit at 5222 Fleet Avenue. Resolution 603, 2020 by Councilmember Polensek, an emergency resolution objecting to the renewal of a D1, D2 liquor permit at 12307 St. Clair Avenue. Resolution 604, 2020 by Councilmember Polensek, an emergency resolution withdrawing objection to the transfer of ownership of a C2 and C2X liquor permit at 15208 Lakeshore Boulevard and repealing Resolution 1026, 2019, objecting to said permit.
Read the motion to suspend the rules.
By Councilmember Polensek, that the rules be suspended and the legislation just read be placed on final passage, seconded by Councilmember Griffin.
Please call the roll.
Kelly, Bishop, Brancatelli, Cleveland, Conwell, Griffin, Hairston, Johnson, Bashir Jones, Joe Jones, Casey, McCormack, Mooney, Polensek, Santana, Slight, Zone. 14 yeas.
Thank you. Second reading emergency ordinances to be passed.
Ordinance 524, 2020 as amended by council members Griffin and Bashir Jones. An emergency ordinance to supplement the codified ordinances of Cleveland, Ohio by enacting new section 241.43 relating to the sale of beverages offered with children's meals by food service operators.
Read the motion to suspend the rules.
By Councilmember Polensek, that the rules be suspended and the legislation just read be placed on final passage, seconded by Councilmember Griffin.
Please call the roll.
Kelly, Bishop, Brancatelli, Cleveland, Conwell, Griffin, Hairston, Johnson, Bashir Jones, Joe Jones, Casey, McCormack, Mooney, Polensek, Santana, Slight, Zone. 14 yeas.
Thank you. Please call the roll on passage.
Kelly, Bishop, Brancatelli, Cleveland, Conwell, Griffin, Hairston, Johnson, Bashir Jones, Joe Jones, Casey, McCormack, Mooney, Polensek, Santana, Slight, Zone. 14 yeas.
Thank you. Second reading emergency resolutions to be adopted.
Resolution 554, 2020 by Councilmember Conwell, an emergency resolution urging the Cleveland Metropolitan School District to change the name of Patrick Henry Middle School to Stephanie Tubbs Jones Middle School.
Read the motion to suspend the rules.
By Councilmember Polensek, that the rules be suspended and the legislation just read be placed on final passage, seconded by Councilmember Griffin.
Please call the roll.
Kelly, Bishop, Brancatelli, Cleveland, Conwell, Griffin, Hairston, Johnson, Bashir Jones, Joe Jones, Casey, McCormack, Mooney, Polensek, Santana, Slight, Zone. 14 yeas.
Please call the roll on adoption.
Kelly, Bishop, Brancatelli, Cleveland, Conwell, Griffin, Hairston, Johnson, Bashir Jones, Joe Jones, Casey, McCormack, Mooney, Polensek, Santana, Slight, Zone. 14 yeas, Mr. President.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, would you please excuse the absences?
By Councilmember Polensek, that the absence of Councilmember Santana is hereby excused, seconded by Councilmember Griffin.
Thank you. This council meeting is adjourned to the call of the chair. Our next regularly scheduled meeting of the council will be held on Wednesday, July 12th, 2020. If there's nothing more for the good of the order, thank you, everybody.
Mr. Chairman,
Councilman?
you had said July 12th. I think you meant August 12th.
Oops. Yeah, that's already passed us, right? So yeah, August 12th, 2020. And in between committee of the whole and now, I just want to say that Councilman Brancatelli has delivered the check for legal aid. And then the medal for the Progi Dash, as well as my t-shirt. So thank you very much. The nice people at Legal Aid, thank you. And the tenants that they'll help. So if there's nothing else for the good of the order, there's nothing else for the good of the order, this council is adjourned. We will meet again August 12th, 2020. Thank you.